Chapter 1. Ash and Ambition. Autumn 1972 had swept over Chicago, and the wind from Lake Michigan carried a chill that bit straight through the bones. Tony, the bull Rossi, sat in a dark corner of a bar in Little Italy, a place that smelled of stale liquor and cigar smoke. His face was harder now, scarred not only by knives, but by the sharp edge of betrayal. After the disaster in the Florida Keys, he, Frankie, the knife, Lombardi, and Olga, the last loyal member of the Bratva, had returned to Chicago to lick their wounds. Carlos El Cuervo Rivera had survived his gunshot wound, but was still weak and hiding in a safe apartment guarded by Tony's men. The diamonds were gone, sunk to the ocean floor, along with Viktor Kuznetsov's burning body, and the deal with the Sandinistas and the Colombians was nothing but a memory. But Tony wasn't a man who gave up. Chicago was his city, and he would rebuild his empire, even if it meant stepping over more corpses. The bar was silent, save for the crackle of an old jukebox playing Sinatra. Frankie sat across from Tony, twirling his knife between his fingers in a nervous tick. "Boss, we're weak," he said in a low voice so as not to draw attention. "The families in New York are talking already. They're saying we're finished, that the Rossi family's just a shadow of what it was, and with Petrov and Interpol breathing down our necks, we need a big win, and we need it now." Olga, who had started to adapt to the streets of Chicago, leaned forward. Her shoulder had healed, but the scar was a constant reminder of Victor's betrayal. "Frankie's right," she said, her Russian accent soft but cutting, "but it's not just Interpol we should worry about. Carlos mentioned something about the Bratva, a bigger plan. I don't think Victor acted alone. Someone in Moscow is pulling the strings, and they won't forget us." Tony lit a cigar and blew out the smoke in a slow spiral. Carlos's words in the lighthouse had gnawed at him ever since their escape. A conspiracy stretching to Moscow and maybe even Washington. If the Bratva had powerful allies, then their betrayal in Miami was only the tip of the iceberg. But right now, his focus was on regaining control. The Chicago mafia was weakened, and rivals like the Irish and the new black gangs on the South Side were encroaching on his territory. He needed money, weapons, and loyalty, and he needed them fast. The door to the bar opened, and a new figure stepped inside. It was Salvatore Sally Morty, an old friend of Tony's and a middleman with connections up and down the East Coast. Sally was a short, round man with a smile that could charm a snake, but his eyes betrayed a cunning that made him dangerous. He sat down at the table without asking and tossed an envelope onto it. "Tony, you look like hell," he said, "but I've got something that can put you back on your feet." Tony opened the envelope and pulled out a bundle of documents, blueprints, name lists, and a map of a port in Baltimore. "What's this?" Tony asked. "An opportunity," Sally replied. "A new deal. There's a shipment in Baltimore heroin, straight from Turkey, worth 20 million on the street. It's controlled by a group calling themselves the Red Captains, a mix of former CIA agents and Russian deserters. They say they've got a buyer in Canada, but I think we can take the load and sell it ourselves. With that money, you could buy back Chicago and maybe even strike back at the Bratva." Tony exchanged a glance with Frankie and Olga. It sounded too good to be true, and after Victor, he was suspicious of anything that glittered. "What's the catch?" he asked. Sally's smile faded. "The catch is the shipment's guarded, heavily guarded, and I've heard rumors Petrov's involved. He's in Baltimore looking for the same shipment, and he's not alone, Interpol's there too, and there's a new player, someone calling himself the Shadow. Nobody knows who he is, but he's got a reputation for being ruthless, even worse than Petrov." Olga clenched her jaw at the mention of Petrov. She had sworn to kill him for his role in Miami, and the thought of meeting him again lit a fire in her eyes. "If Petrov's there, I'm in," she said, "but we need a plan, no more improvisation." Tony nodded. He knew this was their chance to turn the tables, but also a road straight into hell. "We are going to Baltimore," he said, "but we do it my way, no more betrayals." Baltimore. A new arena. They arrived in Baltimore 2 days later, hidden inside a truck Sally had arranged. The city was a maze of ports, factories, and worn-down streets where corruption was as thick as the fog from Chesapeake Bay. They set up in an old warehouse by the docks, a place that smelled of oil and rust. Sally had given them a contact, a former dockworker named Jimmy Rusty Doyle, who knew about the Red Captain's operations. Rusty was a nervous man with shifty eyes, but he had information. "The shipment comes in tomorrow night," he said, pointing at the map. "The ship's called Black Star. It's docking at a private pier, guarded by mercenaries, but it's not just drugs. There are rumors the cargo includes something else. Documents, maybe, something both the CIA and KGB want." Tony felt his instincts sharpen. Documents? This could be the link to Carlos's warning about a larger conspiracy. He glanced at Olga. "What does the Bratva know about this?" he asked. She shook her head. "Nothing. If Victor knew, he never told me, but if it's true, it's bigger than we think." The night of the operation was dark, with rain lashing against the pier. Tony, Frankie, Olga, and a handful of loyal Chicago soldiers crept through the shadows. They carried stolen weapons, pistols, rifles, even a couple of grenades, but they were outnumbered. The Red Captain's mercenaries patrolled the pier, searchlights sweeping across the water, but before they could strike, an explosion echoed in the distance. Chaos erupted, gunfire rattled, and bodies fell. Tony realized they weren't alone. Petrov had struck first. The KGB agent, with his team of ruthless operators, stormed the pier, bullets tearing through the mercenaries. But in the middle of the firefight, a new figure appeared, a man in a black hood, moving like a shadow. He threw a knife that dropped one of Petrov's men, and his laughter echoed over the dock. "Who the hell is that?" Frankie whispered. Tony had no idea, but he knew one thing. This wasn't just a battle over heroin. This was a battle for power, and they had just stepped into a game where no one could trust anyone. Chapter 2, Blood in the Harbor. Rain whipped against the port of Baltimore, and the fog from Chesapeake Bay lay like a heavy blanket over the pier. Tony, the bull Rossi, crouched behind a rusty shipping container, his breath forming small clouds in the cold night air. Gunfire cracked like thunder, and the air was thick with the stench of gunpowder, blood, and wet asphalt. The battle for the cargo aboard the Black Star had erupted into chaos. Ivan Petrov and his ruthless KGB strike team had struck first, their automatic weapons tearing through the Red Captain's mercenaries. But the mysterious figure known only as the Shadow had changed everything. His sudden arrival threw both Petrov's men and Tony's crew into disarray. Whoever he was deadly, and his presence hinted that something far bigger than a heroin shipment was at stake. Frankie, the knife, Lombardi lay flat beside Tony, his blade already stained with the blood of a mercenary he'd silently eliminated earlier. "Boss, this is a goddamn mess," he whispered. "Petrov's here, Interpol's probably not far behind, and that Shadow guy, he ain't some regular hitter. What the hell do we do?" Olga, on Tony's other side, reloaded her submachine gun with crisp precision that betrayed her Bratva training. Her eyes burned with resolve, but there was something else there too, doubt. Victor's betrayal in Miami had shaken her, and Carlos's warning about a larger conspiracy gnawed at her thoughts. "We take the shipment," she said flatly. "The heroin, the documents, whatever it is. If the Shadow's here, it means we're close to the truth." Tony nodded, though every instinct screamed they were outmatched. They had only 6 men left, loyal Chicago soldiers, but hardly enough to face Petrov's elite, the Red Captain's mercs, and the unknown assassins stalking them all. Sally Morty, who'd given them the tip about the deal, had stayed back in the warehouse with Rusty Doyle to coordinate, though Tony suspected Rusty just wanted to stay out of the line of fire. Carlos was still too weak to fight, left behind in Chicago under guard. This was their last shot to flip the board, to seize power back and strike at the enemies hunting them. The battle on the pier. Tony gave the signal, and the crew crept forward, weaving between shipping containers and cranes. The Black Star loomed ahead, a rust-eaten freighter lit by harsh floodlights that cast long, jagged shadows. Petrov's men had already stormed the deck, and the bodies of mercenaries lay scattered, blood mixing with the rainwater pooling on the dock. But somewhere out there, unseen, was the Shadow, an invisible killing machine cutting down both KGB and mercenaries with almost supernatural precision. Tony led his crew to a narrow gangway, a steel bridge groaning under their weight. They'd barely made it halfway when an explosion rocked the pier. One of Petrov's men had lobbed a grenade at a group of mercenaries, igniting a nearby fuel tank. Flames licked toward the sky, and the smoke made it impossible to see. Tony cursed under his breath. This was no longer a stealth job, it was open war. Olga boarded first, moving like a panther, her submachine gun spitting bullets into a mercenary crouched behind a winch. He dropped, his scream lost in the rain. Frankie followed, his knife flashing as he slit another guard's throat. Tony covered them, pistol steady, scanning for the shadow. He'd caught a glimpse of him earlier, a black hood, a lean figure, and a blade moving faster than any human should. Suddenly, a roar erupted from Petrov's position. The KGB agent had climbed a crane and was firing wildly with an assault rifle. His men advanced methodically, but their numbers were thinning. The shadow had already felled 3 of them, their bodies sprawled like rag dolls in the downpour. Petrov himself looked possessed, his scarred face slick with sweat and blood. "Rossi," he bellowed, "I know you're here, I'll skin you alive." Tony ignored him and signaled Olga toward the cargo hold. If the documents Rusty mentioned were aboard, they were the key to understanding the conspiracy. But before they reached the hatch, the shadow struck. He leapt from a container, his blade plunging into one of Tony's men's chest. The soldier collapsed wordlessly, blood gushing like a fountain. Olga opened fire, but the shadow was gone, swallowed by the smoke. "Who the hell is he?" Frankie yelled, voice cracking with frustration. "Someone we don't have time for," Tony snapped. "Focus on the cargo." They broke open the cargo hatch and found crates labeled medical supplies, but inside were sacks of pure heroin, enough to flood the East Coast. And in a separate steel case, they found what they were really after, a folder of documents in both Russian and English. Tony flipped through quickly, catching words like Operation Red Dawn, Washington, and Bratva funding. This was bigger than he'd imagined, a plan that could shake global powers, but footsteps pounded on the deck. Petrov had found them. He burst into the hold, rifle raised. "Drop the documents, Rossi," he growled. "They're not for you," Tony gave a cold smile. "Come take 'em, Rusky." The fight that followed was brutal. Petrov lunged at Tony, and the 2 men crashed to the floor, knives and fists flying. Olga fired at Petrov's men, but a bullet tore through her leg, and she went down screaming. Frankie fought like a madman, driving his knife into a KGB agent's arm, blood spraying across the bulkhead. In the chaos, the shadow appeared again. He tossed a smoke grenade, filling the hold with choking fog. Tony heard cold, inhuman laughter, then a scream as one of Petrov's men went down. The shadow wasn't there to help anyone. He was a predator hunting everyone. Tony grabbed the documents and dragged Olga toward the exit. Frankie covered them, but a bullet smashed into his shoulder, and he cursed loudly. They reached the deck, where the fire from the explosion now threatened to engulf the entire ship. Tony spotted a lifeboat and made his decision. "We are out of here," he shouted. They leapt into the boat, Petrov's shouts echoing behind them. The shadow was nowhere in sight, but Tony knew he was still close. As they rode into the fog, with the documents hidden under Tony's coat, he realized they'd scored a small victory, but at a steep price. Olga was wounded, Frankie bleeding, and the shipment still aboard the burning freighter. Back on the pier, Petrov watched flames consume the Black Star. His face was a mask of rage, but he already had a new plan. He'd seen the folder in Tony's hands, and he knew what it contained. "This isn't over," he muttered to himself, "not by a long shot." In the lifeboat, Tony turned to Olga. "What do these papers say?" he asked. She shook her head, pale with pain. "I don't know, but if the Bratva's involved, it's something that could start a war." Chapter 3, The Price of Truth. The waves pounded against the small lifeboat as it slid through the dark waters of Chesapeake Bay. The rain had eased, but the fog still hung thick, a grey wall hiding Tony, the bull, Rossi, and his crew from the world. Tony sat at the oars, his hands gripping them tight, while the Black Star documents lay hidden under his jacket, pressed against his chest like a ticking bomb. Frankie, the knife, Lombardi lay in the bottom of the boat, his shoulder bleeding from a bullet wound, but he gritted his teeth and kept his knife ready. Olga, despite the pain in her wounded leg, had managed to bandage herself with a strip torn from her shirt, staring into the darkness with eyes full of rage and doubt. Ivan Petrov's screams still echoed in their ears, and the shadow, the mysterious killer, was out there somewhere, an invisible death that could strike at any moment. Baltimore was behind them, but the fight over the heroin shipment and the documents had changed everything. Tony knew they'd stumbled onto something bigger than a simple mafia deal. Carlos, El Cuervo, Rivera's warning about a conspiracy stretching from Moscow to Washington now felt more real than ever. The documents could be the key, but unlocking that door might also be their undoing. They reached an abandoned fishing harbor on a remote stretch of coast, where Sally Morty waited with a van. He looked nervous, his usual cocky grin replaced by a deep frown. "What the hell happened out there?" he asked, staring at their bloody clothes and Frankie's pale face. "You look like you've been through hell." "We have," Tony growled, tossing the folder onto the seat. "Get us out of here, Sally. We need a safe place, and we need it now." Sally drove them to an old motel outside Baltimore, a place that reeked of mold and cheap booze. Rusty Doyle, their doc contact, was already there with a doctor, a shady character named Doc Malone, known for patching up gangsters without asking questions. While Doc stitched Frankie's shoulder and Olga's leg, Tony sat at a wobbly table and opened the folder. Olga and Sally stood behind him, their breath heavy in the stuffy air. The documents were a mix of encrypted messages, lists of names and places, and detailed plans. Tony wasn't an academic, but he could read well enough to see this was dynamite. "Operation Red Dawn," he read aloud. "It's about weapons smuggling, but not just to Latin America. They mention Africa, the Middle East, and the US. Bratva is funding groups here, Sally, revolutionaries, maybe even terrorists. And there are names, politicians, CIA agents, even a senator." Olga paled. "Bratva doesn't do that without orders from the top. This must come from Moscow, maybe even the Kremlin. But why?" Sally scratched his neck, his eyes darting. "This is bigger than we thought. If this is true, it's not just Petrov chasing you. It's the whole damn world." Frankie, lying on a bed with his shoulder bandaged, snorted. "And the shadow, who is he? Some CIA spook, or just another Russian psycho?" Tony shook his head. "I don't know, but he's not on anyone's side. He killed Petrov's men just as easily as he killed the mercs. He wants something, maybe these papers." A new enemy before they could dig deeper. A sound came from outside the motel, tires crunching on gravel. Tony grabbed his pistol and crept to the window. 2 black cars had pulled up, and men in dark suits stepped out. But they weren't Petrov's KGB team or Interpol agents. These men moved with another kind of precision, like they'd been trained for something far more secret than law enforcement. One of them, a tall figure in a black hood, stood in the shadows. The shadow. "It's him," Olga whispered, her voice shaking with fear and anger. "He's found us." Tony made a quick decision. "Sally, take the documents and go. Frankie, Olga, we hold them off." Sally hesitated, then grabbed the folder and bolted for the back door. Doc Malone, realizing he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, fled with him. Tony, Frankie, and Olga barricaded the door with furniture and loaded their weapons. Seconds later, a window shattered and a smoke grenade rolled in. The room filled with choking fumes as bullets ripped through the air. The shadow was first through. He moved like a phantom, his knives flashing in the dim light. One of Tony's soldiers went down instantly, his throat cut in a clean line. Olga fired wildly, but the shadow was too fast, his movements almost inhuman. Frankie lunged with his knife, but the shadow parried and kicked him hard in the chest, sending him crashing into the wall. Tony met the shadow in brutal hand-to-hand combat. He couldn't match the killer's speed, but his raw strength gave him a chance. He grabbed a broken chair and smashed it over the shadow's head, making him stagger. For the first time, Tony saw his eyes under the hood, cold, gray, utterly inhuman. "Who are you?" Tony growled. The shadow laughed, a sound that cut through the smoke. "You're just a pawn, Rossi. Give me the documents and maybe you live." Before Tony could answer, sirens wailed. Interpol had arrived, led by Marie Dupont. Her team stormed the motel, and the chaos exploded. The shadow hurled another smoke grenade and vanished into the night, leaving Tony's crew to face Dupont's agents. But Petrov was there too, his KGB squad coming in from another direction, and suddenly the motel was a war zone. Olga, wounded leg and all, fought like a fury. She gunned down an Interpol agent and stabbed another with a knife she snatched off the floor. Blood splattered the walls as screams filled the air. Frankie, dazed but alive, managed to pull the pin on a grenade and hurl it at Petrov's men, buying them a few precious seconds. Tony led them out the back door to where Sally's van waited. They piled in as Sally floored it, tires screeching on asphalt. But the documents were gone. Sally had lost them in the chaos, and Tony suspected the Shadow had them now. A fragile alliance when they reached a safe house, an abandoned farmhouse outside Baltimore. The mood was grim. Olga raged over losing the documents, Frankie was weak from blood loss, and Tony felt the crushing weight of failure. But he knew they couldn't quit. The papers hinted at a conspiracy that could change the world, and the Shadow was the key to understanding it. "We have to find him," Tony said, "and we have to hit Petrov and DuPont back. But first we need to know who's pulling the strings. If Bratva's involved, Olga, what do you know?" Olga shook her head, her face hard. "I don't know, but I have contacts in New York, old Bratva soldiers who might help us. They hate traitors, and if Victor was part of something bigger, they might know." Tony nodded. New York was dangerous territory, ruled by the 5 families, but it was their next move. "We go there," he said, "and we take back what's ours or die trying." In the distance, thunder rolled, and Tony knew the storm had only just begun. Chapter 4, The Labyrinth of New York City, October 1972. The city pulsed like a living organism, its streets filled with neon lights, traffic, and secrets. The skyscrapers cast long shadows over the grimy alleys of Hell's Kitchen, where Tony, the Bull, Rossi, and his crew had settled in a safe apartment belonging to one of Olga's old Bratva contacts. The apartment was a cramped hole, with peeling wallpaper and a constant smell of cigarette smoke, but it was hidden in the heart of the mafia's territory, perfect for avoiding both Ivan Petrov's KGB agents and Marie Dupont's Interpol team. Tony stood by the window, his eyes scanning the street below, always alert. The Black Star documents were gone, stolen by the mysterious Shadow, but their contents, hints of Operation Red Dawn, and a conspiracy linking the Bratva to power centers in Moscow and Washington, were burned into his memory. This was no longer just a fight for money or power, it was a fight for survival. Frankie, the knife, Lombardi sat at a rickety table, his shoulders still sore from the gunshot in Baltimore. He sharpened his knife on a whetstone, the sound sharp in the quiet apartment. "New York's a damn death trap, boss," he muttered. "The 5 families don't like outsiders, and we're already on their radar. If they find out we're hunting the Shadow, or worse, digging into Bratva business, we're dead." Olga, who had recovered from her wounded leg but carried a weight of doubt, leaned against the wall. Her loyalty to the Bratva had been shaken after Victor's betrayal, but she couldn't let go of the thought that her organization might be hiding something even darker. "My contact will be here soon," she said, her Russian accent sharp. "Dmitry Volkov. He was Victor's mentor once, but they parted ways. If anyone knows what Operation Red Dawn is, it's him." Tony nodded, but his instincts were on high alert. New York was not Chicago. Here he was not a king, but an intruder. The 5 families who controlled the city's underworld were already annoyed by his presence, and with Petrov and DuPont still on their heels, plus the Shadow's invisible threat, every step was a risk. But he had no choice. The documents hinted at a plan that could destabilize the entire world, and if he could expose it, he might turn it to his advantage and crush his enemies in the process. The meeting with Dmitry Volkov, arrived late at night. A broad-shouldered man with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much. He wore a worn leather coat and carried an aura of authority that made even Tony tense. Olga introduced them, but her voice was strained. She didn't fully trust Dmitry, despite their shared history. They sat around the table, a bottle of vodka between them as a silent gesture of respect. "Operation Red Dawn," Tony said bluntly, glancing at Dmitry. "What is it? And what does the Bratva have to do with it?" Dmitry lit a cigarette and exhaled smoke slowly. "You're brave, Rossi, or stupid, maybe both. Red Dawn isn't just a business. It's a plan to shift the balance of power. The Bratva, together with certain, let's call them stakeholders in the US, finance groups that can create chaos. Guerrillas in Africa, terrorists in the Middle East, and yes, even radical groups here in America. The goal is to weaken the West, create a market for weapons and drugs, and give Moscow an edge in the Cold War. Olga stared at him, her face pale. And Victor, was he part of it? Dmitri nodded. Victor was a cog, but not the brain. He reported to someone higher up, a man who calls himself the architect. No one knows who he is, not even me, but the Shadow, he is the architect's right hand. A killer with no loyalty, only orders. Tony clenched his fists. And the documents, what were they? A list, Dmitri replied. Names of contacts, locations of weapons deliveries, and financial transactions. If they fall into the wrong hands, like Petrov's or Interpol's, the whole operation could collapse. But if you get them, Rossi, you have the power to either stop it or take it over. Frankie snorted. Take it over? We're on the run, Dmitri. We don't even have enough men to take on Petrov, let alone a global conspiracy. Dmitri smirked. Then you need allies. I can give you a way in, a meeting with one of the 5 families, the Gambinos. They also have an interest in stopping the Bratva, but they won't do it for free. Tony leaned forward. What do they want? They want a cut of the pie, said Dmitri. And they want the Shadow dead. He's already killed 2 of their capos. They think he's a freelancer, but I know better. The trap in Brooklyn, the meeting with the Gambinos, was arranged in an abandoned warehouse in Brooklyn, a place that smelled of oil and mold. Tony, Frankie, and Olga entered armed to the teeth, aware that it could be a trap. The Gambino's representative, an older man named Vinny, the Fox, Caruso, waited with a dozen heavily armed men. His smile was cold, but his words were straightforward. We want the Shadow, he said, and we want the Bratva's plans. In return, you get protection and a chance to take back Chicago. Tony nodded, but before he could respond, a side door in the warehouse exploded. The Shadow had struck. He threw a smoke grenade, and chaos erupted instantly. His knives flashed in the dark, and 2 of the Gambino men fell, their throats slashed. Blood sprayed across the concrete floor, and screams filled the air. Olga opened fire, but the Shadow was like a phantom, vanishing into the smoke before bullets could hit. Tony lunged forward and grabbed Vinny, who had fallen to the floor. Stay down, he shouted. Frankie fought one of the Shadow's men, not mercenaries, but trained killers as deadly as their leader. A bullet hit Frankie in the leg, and he fell with a roar, but he managed to drive his knife into the opponent's stomach, blood flowing like a river. Amid the chaos, sirens blared. Interpol had tracked them, and Marie Dupont stormed in with her team, but Petrov was also there, his KGB agents attacking from another side. The warehouse became a battlefield, with bullets whizzing and bodies falling. Tony saw the Shadow one last time, his hood fluttering in the wind as he leapt out a window and disappeared. Olga dragged Frankie to safety while Tony covered them. Vinny, who had survived the attack, grabbed Tony's arm. Find the Shadow, he hissed, or you're dead to us. They fled into the chaos, with Interpol and the KGB on their heels. Tony had no documents, no cargo, and now a new enemy in the Gambinos if they didn't deliver. But he had a clue, Dmitri's words about the architect. If he could find this mysterious leader, he might uncover the entire conspiracy. Hiding in an alley, rain lashing against their faces, Tony turned to Olga. We have to find the architect, he said, and we have to do it before the Shadow finds us. Olga nodded, her eyes hard. New York is just the beginning. This goes deeper than we thought. Chapter 5. The end of an era. The streets of New York lay quiet at dawn, but beneath the surface, the city was simmering with tension. Tony, the Bull, Rossi, Frankie, the Knife, Lombardi, and Olga had fled the chaos of the Brooklyn warehouse, where the Shadow's attack and the clash with Interpol and the KGB had left a trail of blood. They sought refuge in an abandoned church in the Bronx, a crumbling building with cracked windows and an altar thick with dust. Tony stood by a broken pew, his hands still stained with the blood from the fight. The documents from Black Star were gone, the Shadow was still at large, and the Gambino family had given them an ultimatum: find the Shadow and expose Bratva's plans, or die. But Tony was not a man to bow to threats. He was a survivor, and he would fight to his last breath. Frankie lay on a mattress in the church's sacristy, his leg and shoulder bandaged, but still throbbing. He had lost a lot of blood in Brooklyn, and his face was pale as wax. "Boss, we are screwed," he muttered, his voice weak but edged with anger. "The Gambinos are going to hunt us, Petrov's like a rabid dog, and that shadow, he's not human. What the hell do we do?" Olga, cleaning her submachine gun by a window, glanced at Tony. Her loyalty to Bratva was in shambles, but her resolve remained intact. "Dmitri gave us a name, the architect," she said. "If we find him, we find the answers. But we have to move fast. Petrov won't give up, and Interpol is too close." Tony nodded, his mind racing. Dmitri's words about Operation Red Dawn and the architect had changed everything. This was no longer just a mafia matter, it was a global conspiracy, and he had been caught in the middle. But the church was no safe haven, and he knew time was short. They needed a plan, and they needed it now. The final meeting an hour later, Dmitri Volkov, a Bratva veteran, arrived at the church. He looked weary, his graying hair plastered to his forehead from the rain that had started falling again. He carried a small bag, which he dropped on the floor. "Weapons and ammo," he said tersely, "and a lead. The architect is in New York. He operates from a private club in Manhattan, a place called the Black Orchid. That's where he meets his contacts, CIA, Bratva, maybe even politicians. But you're not getting in without me." Tony narrowed his eyes. "Why should we trust you, Volkov? You were Victor's mentor. How do we know you're not part of this?" Dmitri smirked, his eyes cold. "Because I hate the architect more than you do. He betrayed Bratva just like Victor betrayed you. I want to see him dead." Olga stared at Dmitri, her hand resting on her pistol. "And the shadow?" she asked. "Is he there?" Dmitri nodded. "The shadow is the architect's shadow. Where one is, the other is near." Tony made a decision. "We strike tonight, but if you betray us, Volkov, you'll be the first to die." Night in Manhattan, the Black Orchid, was an exclusive club hidden in an unassuming Manhattan building, behind a marble facade and guarded by security. Tony, Frankie, Olga, and Dmitri approached under the cover of darkness, dressed in stolen suits to blend in. Dmitri had bribed a guard to get them inside, but Tony trusted no one, not even him. Inside the club, the air was thick with cigar smoke and jazz music. Men in expensive suits and women in furs moved like shadows, their voices low but heavy with power. Dmitri pointed out a man in a private lounge, surrounded by bodyguards. He was older, with silver hair and a face that radiated authority, the architect. But before they could approach, a side door exploded and the shadow appeared. Chaos erupted. The shadow's knives flashed, and two bodyguards fell, their throats cut in a bloody cascade. Tony lunged forward, his pistol firing shots that echoed through the club. Olga shot at the shadow's men, her bullets striking one in the chest, blood splattering over a crystal chandelier. Frankie, despite his injuries, fought like a man possessed, his knife slicing through a bodyguard's arm. The architect tried to flee, but Dmitri blocked his path. "You're finished, traitor," he growled, drawing his pistol, but before he could fire, the shadow threw a knife that struck Dmitri in the heart. The old Bratva veteran fell, his blood staining the marble floor red. Tony confronted the shadow in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The killer's speed was superhuman, but Tony was driven by pure rage. He grabbed a broken bottle from the bar and slashed at the shadow's face, ripping off his hood. For the first time, he saw his face, young, scarred, with eyes that belonged to no human. "Who are you?" Tony roared. The shadow laughed, blood dripping from his cheek. "You'll never understand," he said before tossing a smoke grenade and disappearing. But the fight was not over. Interpol stormed the club, led by Marie Dupont, and seconds later Petrov appeared with his KGB agents. Bullets flew and bodies fell. The architect tried to escape in the chaos, but Olga caught up to him. She shot him in the back, and he collapsed with a scream, blood seeping across the floor. Tony, Frankie, and Olga fled through a back door, Petrov's shouts echoing behind them. They had killed the architect, but the shadow still had the documents, and the conspiracy remained alive. Hiding in an alley with sirens in the distance, Tony realized they had won a battle, but at a cost. Dmitri was dead, and the Gambinos would not be satisfied until the shadow was too. A new path at the first light of dawn. Tony, Frankie and Olga sat in a stolen car, heading out of New York. Olga held a piece of paper she had found in the architect's pocket, an address in London and a name, Voronov. It was their next lead. "We're not done," Tony said, his voice hard. "The shadow is out there, and he has the documents. We're going to London. This isn't over until we've crushed them all." Frankie nodded, his face grimacing in pain. "And Petrov, he'll follow us," Olga said, "but next time he's the one who dies."